Well, welcome everybody. My name is Norbert Peabody. I'm the president of the Society, and it's a real pleasure today to be able to introduce Mansi Rao, who is the senior curator at the South Asia Collection Museum in Norwich, and to celebrate the launch of her book and to celebrate her project on vernacular furniture and in northwestern India. The Society is a absolutely appropriate place to be celebrating this work for two different reasons. One is that the South Asia Collection Museum in Norwich and the Society have a very long-standing and close connection. We often spend very happy away days in Norwich looking at the collection. Most recently this past spring, and a few years before that as well. And secondly, given that her talk is about the vernacular furniture of northwestern India, I would like to promote the Society and calling attention to the fact that this Society has one of the world's largest collections outside of India of vernacular literature from northwestern India, particularly Rajasthan and Gujarat. And this collection that we have here was collected in the early 19th century by Colonel James Todd, who was the first librarian of the Society and one of the founding members of the Society, and leaving a collection of manuscripts and transcribed oral tales that runs into the several hundreds, which makes us, I can't think of another collection outside of India that is as rich in this material. Similarly, the South Asia Collection Museum in Norwich must be the richest collection in vernacular furniture from northwestern India anywhere in the world outside of India. Mansi and her team have done just an amazing job in putting together a series of catalogs and sort of source books around the collection, which we are very excited to be able to see. And so I will not take up any more of her time. You've come here to listen to her, not me. But let's welcome Mansi to the Society.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Norbert. And I have to thank Susan and Alison for the invite to speak here, and also to Matty for organizing all the logistics for this evening. As it's already been said, my talk this evening will focus on experiences and learnings from an 8-year-long project on vernacular furniture in Northwest India. To begin talking about the project, though, an introduction to the South Asia Collection in Norwich is necessary. The collection is managed by the South Asian Decorative Arts and Crafts Collection Trust, a charitable trust whose objective is to record, conserve, and promote the arts, crafts, and cultures of South Asia and adjacent countries. The trust was founded by Philip and Jeannie Millward, on the basis of their own personal collection of art, textiles, everyday objects, furniture, and a diverse selection of craft objects, which they collected during their work and travels in South Asia since 1979. Their work primarily involved sourcing craft examples for their retail business, which now serves as our museum shop. With a keen interest for craft traditions, they sort of gradually built up a collection of objects, which in 2006 was formally assessed by a team at the Pitt Rivers Museum led by Professor Claire Harris. And based on that assessment, a further assessment was conducted in 2011 by a team at the British Museum, guided by Professor John Mack. And both these assessment reports sort of concluded that the collection was unique amongst the landscape of museums and collections, especially in the UK. So on the basis of these assessment reports, the trust was set up in 2010 to look after this collection, which now is a growing number of 10,000 items in the collection. And as we stand today, the objectives of the trust is to become sort of important research center on South Asian material culture and living craft traditions. The collection includes, amongst these 10,000 items, about 250 vernacular furniture pieces from Northwest India. The number sort of slightly increases when you look at furniture from the rest of the country and from the adjacent countries that we work in. But for the sake of this project, I'm going to simply focus on those 250 pieces of furniture that we've got from Northwest India. The furniture examples were mostly acquired in the 80s and 90s, primarily from dealers trading in secondhand furniture. And much like all museums and collections, we often reflect on how these objects end up in collections and museums. Throughout their life and their working life, Philip and Jeannie have made a conscious effort to think through where these objects come from, what their histories are, and they've tried to record as much information as they've been able to find at the source in our object records. And they've even undertaken craft process documentation with sort of craftspeople and craft communities that they worked with. However, all through these years, the one thing that they realized was information around furniture and built environments was quite limited. And of course, when we were embarking on this project, the primary question we were asking was, how do these furniture pieces end up in that trade market? Essentially, families adapting to new lifestyles, moving to newer homes, having different aspirations as compared to their previous generations, are often faced with the dilemma of whether you hold on to objects from the past or you let go. And when the latter happens, of course, they make their way into a space which is outside of their context of use and outside of their context of making. And in the case of furniture, particularly in Northwest India, when people started moving into newer homes and started moving away into cities, or there was also migration abroad, a lot of objects which were made using craft traditions in the region were considered quite valuable. So often houses would be dismantled and the wood carving would be separated out and sold off into the trade market. And similarly, furniture, which was carved using sort of precious wood like teak wood, would be sold off as well for purely the monetary value associated with it. And this sort of complex route, sort of the fact that moves away from the home, it moves into these contexts of trade. And of course, from the traders, it then ends up in, it could end up in other homes, it could end up in sites of sort of heritage hotels and as a way of dressing up these spaces. And one of the places it also ends up is in the sort of export handicraft trade. And often what happens is that the stories that are associated and the personal associations that these objects have get lost in that process of them moving outside of their context. And often the same is true for most material objects that move into collections. And for that reason, one of the primary objectives, both for Philip and Jeannie from a personal standpoint of view and for the trust, has always been to contextualize the collection through the lens of people who actually make and use them. And the fact that the collection has objects that relate to living traditions actually gives us the advantage to do so. With that intention, in 2014, Philip and Jeannie had come across Professor Jay Thakkar, who was then research director of the Design, Innovation and Craft Resource Center at CEPT University in Ahmedabad. His work was based on wood carving in traditional houses in Gujarat. He was invited over to conduct a short research on the architectural pieces that we have in the collection, which are from Gujarat. And on this visit, it was realized that the center the center at the time had the experience of working at the grassroots with various craft communities. And the kind of projects that the center was undertaking was related to craft documentation, craft innovation projects, but essentially all working with craftspeople. And one of the projects that the center was also undertaking was the documentation of traditional and vernacular houses across India to develop detailed drawing portfolios of these houses. And on this visit, it was decided that the center could perhaps extend their work in the space of architecture to furniture, and a collaboration was set up between the trust and the center at CEPT University to research vernacular furniture in the collection. The project really then began with the museological need and intention for researching and representing the collection items that we had. However, it sort of grew into its full form as it stands today, based on a number of parameters. And the primary one is sort of encounters and interactions with the source communities with who we worked to gather this body of knowledge. These interactions not only provided opportunities for creation of new knowledge, but also informed the methodology for this project. And for that reason, I'm going to focus on using a methodological narration as an approach for this evening's talk. The research was conducted between 2015 and 2022 with fieldwork spanning across Northwest India, which is in the states of Gujarat, Rajasthan, Punjab, and Haryana. And it really aimed at identifying, mapping, documenting, and studying vernacular furniture that traditionally and inherently continues to be part of the day-to-day activities in an Indian household. And of course, I stand here today not as a person who's embarked on this project all by myself, but we had a wonderful team working on the project on both ends, both at the center and at the trust. And I'm speaking today here having been on both ends of the project. So I used to work at the Design Innovation and Craft Resource Center, and I led the field work on this project. And now I'm working as the curator at the trust and sort of seeing an afterlife of the project. So my presentation today is going to approach the project from both those positions of having conducted field work and looking at the other end within the collection as well. But I just wanted to point out that it's a huge effort undertaken by a massive team. And it's been a privilege for me to have worked with this team over the past 8 years. As with any research, our first step was to look at previous research and secondary sources on the subject. And to our surprise, we realized that there was barely any material on the subject. There were a few locally specific studies. For example, there's a bit of information on furniture made from mud in sort of rural Kutch, as mentioned in the book Mud, Mirror and Thread on Kutch. Professor Jyotindra Jain had conducted a small fieldwork project in the 70s to provide context to a small collection of furniture at the Shreyas Museum in Ahmedabad. So that was the other focused work that we found. And then there were small descriptions of what rural crafting looked like in parts of Saurashtra in Fisher's and Hakusha's book. But apart from that, we realized that a cohesive, coherent, and a sort of consolidated research on furniture had never been undertaken before. And at this point, we decided to rely on our own background of working with architecture. And of course, when you look at the context of architecture, the term vernacular sort of presents a strong emphasis on local materials and regional identities. So we decided to use that as a starting point to decide what vernacular furniture could be, because one has to bear in mind that although we had encountered vernacular architecture, there was never a mention of vernacular furniture up until this point in the context of India. So we really also had to define what vernacular furniture meant before we embarked on the research. So this was really the first task at understanding what vernacular furniture could be. And we decided to use this idea of local materials and regional identities as starting points. The second aspect was, of course, we had to decide where were we going to look for these furniture pieces and pinpoint what we were looking for as well. And it was at this stage we realized that there were going to be a few hiccups before we could embark on the project. And this is what I like to call starting troubles in the project. To look at where furniture could be located, we conducted an extensive survey of the furniture pieces in the collection. We put together a toolkit for fieldwork to be commenced. And this toolkit sort of consisted of object photographs, object records from the collection, including sort of acquisition records and information that we had from the time of collecting. And this was going to serve as a visual guide for us to embark on our pilot studies, which we centered around Ahmedabad because that was where the center was. And we decided that was the easiest way to sort of begin looking at furniture. And based on what we had as information from the collection objects as to where they could be from, which always often pinpointed to a specific district or a specific state, we soon realized that to look at material culture within the region, we had to deviate away from political and administrative boundaries and look at the geocultural demarcations of these places as people associated with them. So often these cultural divisions were also based on climate, landscape, and sometimes in places like Rajasthan, it's also based on former ruling kingdoms that were part of the state. So we used these sort of cultural divisions within the states as a way of situating furniture and making connections to place. On our pilot study, the easiest thing to also do was to start looking at furniture that was more familiar to us, because there were types that were unfamiliar at the time. And the charpai was one of the pieces of furniture that came up quite frequently in our pilot studies. But what we realized was when we were talking to people who actually make and use them, nobody uses the word charpai. And there's various names such as dholio, khatlo, khatli, palang, and dhorni that were used. And this was just within the context of Gujarat. So of course, there's the component of the nuances in language and dialects that we knew was going to be an important parameter for the study. And then we were also encountered with this kehvat, which is like a saying or a folklore in local languages. It says, Bar game boli badle base ane pani, which literally translates to the language, the attire, and the taste of water changes every 12 villages. And this was something that people loved telling us when we asked them about why there were all these different names for the charpai that we were encountering. So we knew that language had to be a key focus in our study. And then I'd like to point out to one of the earliest classification chart after our pilot studies that we developed. And just to point out how inherited notions of what furniture is also impacted our research. So after our pilot study, we came back and we started categorizing all these objects under our popularly known types of chair and table and benches. But obviously, having encountered these nuances of language, we knew that we had to deviate away from looking at known notions of what furniture meant and had to start paying attention to local names and local dialects. And this really became the primary way of identifying furniture for us. And then, of course, because we were borrowing from our own experience of conducting architectural research, we soon realized that it wasn't going to be so easy to study furniture using the same methods, because we had to go into people's homes, into people's personal spaces to actually study furniture in use and in its context. So it really required an element of trust to be built up. For this, as a team, we decided that we had to come up with a methodology or a method to access and to have people's knowledge onto the project. So the first step that we undertook in the process of developing the methodology was to actually build connections. And the way we did this was through a whole network of primary contacts. So we would end up asking our friends, our colleagues, people at local panchayat offices, other institutions and organizations, if they knew anyone who had furniture. And of course, bear in mind, we've got this visual guide from the collection to use as a source to talk people through for what we were looking for. And soon enough, those primary contacts would then lead us to a secondary set of contacts who would say, well, I know someone in this village and this town. And once we were in those villages and towns, that would lead to a tertiary set of contacts. And then it really became a huge network of connections that we were able to form with people, all based on trust and personal associations. And that really was the strongest point for us in conducting this project, because that's really what opened up people's homes for us. And we were invited into people's homes to look at their furniture and their objects of personal use. Once we were invited into people's homes, of course, the task to undertake was identifying furniture. And with all of these parameters set in place for the study, we embarked on carrying out field visits. And the field visits spanned across a whole year in each state. So we sort of used to split up into visits of about 10 or 12 visits every month, trying to sort of capture a larger geographic area as well. And the kind of tools we used for identifying furniture was essentially to think about different modes of inquiry as well. And then based on all of these parameters, we developed a specific tool, which was essentially a survey mapping tool, a digital tool that we formulated at the center. And this had questions of what the local name was, and we tried to provide an English equivalent for it so that it could inform the research in the future. We were also recording things like what sort of context was it in, whether it was in a residence, whether it was in a public building. We were documenting information about materials, craft techniques, and so on. But the other thing that we also introduced into the form was a geospatial tool to record the latitude and longitude of the objects in situ. So eventually, we were able to develop a digital map of all the furniture that we've been able to record. Using this sort of mapping and identification process, we were able to sort of visit about 429 villages, cities, and towns across Northwest India. And those maps sort of show the spread of the field work that was undertaken. And we were able to record about 7,886 pieces across Northwest India. And these were varying types of furniture, ranging from part, which is a low C, to charpoys, to pataras, which are hope chests given to a bride in Gujarat, and to also include objects that are associated with the use of furniture types that we were identifying. And these furniture pieces that we mapped and identified, we were further able to put them under a typology, which of course involved a huge amount of data analysis based on what we were collecting and the kind of information that we were bringing back from field. And we were able to actually create a typology chart for all of Northwest India, which included, we identified about 167 types of furniture that we categorized as vernacular furniture. And often because use was the primary parameter for how people actually associated with these furniture and objects. So we further tried to group them under 5 broad categories of seating, sleeping, storage surfaces, and objects. And we were mindful that categories bring with it its own problems, but it was necessary given that it was the first ever study that was being conducted on furniture. And then, of course, it brings us to not just identifying and locating them, but then asking questions of what are these furniture pieces used for, and what associations people have with them, and what sort of cultural associations are formed to sort of situate these furniture pieces within a broader context of society. For this, we relied on a cross-disciplinary approach of bringing together anthropology and design as 2 parameters, with the anthropological approaches giving us answers to these questions of use and beliefs and associations that people have. And on the other hand, the discipline of design providing us access to learning about the craft traditions and the making practices that are used in the making of furniture. So using this framework, there was 2 components. The first was really recording stories while conducting fieldwork. And for this, oral history was the primary tool. And we also used a lot of visual material for recording information, which included photography and also videos and audiovisual recordings as well. And we also developed sort of object-specific forms where we could then eventually analyze and put all these bits of information into at a later analysis stage. And of course, stories weren't recorded only within people's homes or within buildings. Sometimes it was also along the journey. The image at the top right is one of my favorites, where the team was traveling on a train, and sometimes people just want to know what you're up to, where you're going. And that would spark off conversations, and that would again lead to sort of further building of connections. So we were really privileged to be invited into various people's homes and listen to their stories. And what I want to do for the rest of the talk is focus on some of these stories that we heard from people and to point out and highlight some of mine and the team's favorite furniture pieces and favorite experiences from the project. The first thing was when we were visiting people's homes, the first act was we would get offered water, especially in Rajasthan. And this was, of course, given that the climatic conditions in the state are so. And as we would enter people's homes, we would see a small little wall niche built into the walls of their exteriors, which would serve as a storage space for holding water pots. Sometimes these water pots could be for washing one's feet and hands, which is a hygiene practice which is followed in most parts of India. This is one such storage, and therefore is located at a lower level in the wall. And in other places, it would be at a higher height, and that would be meant for drinking. And of course, it would be meant for someone who is probably having a commute and immediately quench your thirst before even entering the house. And given the sort of cultural sensitivity around water in the region, we realized that there was a diverse range of furniture types that were created for the purpose of storing water. Water was often stored in pots and pitchers, which could be made of terracotta, which could be made of copper, or nowadays stainless steel as well. And one of the most common form of water storage furniture that we recorded on the research was what you see on screen here is called a gharuchi. and it literally translates to for a pot. And a gharuchi is shaped like a trestle structure, often with 4 legs. And the surface on which the pot rests is got a frame and with chamfered corners so that the pot doesn't topple over. And tiny details of ornamentation are added onto it, often animal and bird features at the corners of the gharuchi. When we started traveling in southern Rajasthan in the Wagad region, the water storage became an inbuilt furniture. And this was a common sight in pretty much every home in parts of southern Rajasthan. But as soon as you enter the home, you find a whole receptacle designed for the storage of water right at the entrance. And this furniture was called a paniara or a paneri. And if you notice, it's got various components to it. One is the main receptacle where the water is stored. But the ledge that holds the water pot often has a sort of receptacle created and a sort of chamfer within the surface of the stone that's created to hold the water pots. And then, of course, the surface itself slopes and leads to a spout, because when you use terracotta pots, there's excess water that could seep out of the pots. And that excess water flows into that spout, and the little blue plastic bowl that you see is to collect that extra water that's dripping off the spout. And then, of course, there's another ledge right at the top, which is space to hold your tumblers and other vessels used in the process of consuming water or storing water. And a closer observation also leads us to realize that there are wall hooks that are built into the wall, which are called kuti. And these are specifically built around the water storage to hold what's called induni or indi, which are pot rings, which women use to support water pots on their heads. So the whole thing has a very systematic design around it, incorporating all the elements around the activity of collecting water to storing water to consuming water. So this was in in parts of southern Rajasthan. While this one's quite plain with mud plaster on it, in many parts of Rajasthan, we also saw it quite brightly colored, along with to sort of fit into the rest of the house aesthetics. And as we went north in the Shekhawati region, where it was common to see large havelis meant for families with more than sort of 20, 30 people, storage space for water turned into rooms, which were called pendo. And again, a U-shaped stone platform is built within the room with space to store water pots. You can see the depressions on the surface in this image quite clearly. But of course, a lot of these havelis in the Shekhawati region are no longer used by families who once used to live there. So therefore, an empty pendo in the image. But these were the kind of various spaces and furniture types that we were recording for furniture. But to just highlight how this act of water storage extends even into a public space. While we were traveling from Jodhpur to a village called Pipar in Rajasthan, we came across this public water storage space called a Pyavu, and it's a public space maintained by people within the community, essentially meant to cater to passers-by and travelers who might like to have a stop and have a drop of water. And to sort of enable the maintenance of these spaces, a little donation box would be placed there called a daan peti, and one was free to sort of leave whatever one liked. But this was something that we encountered all across Rajasthan. And while we were recording furniture, we were also quite mindful that on one hand, there was this idea of local materials, but on the other hand, one had to remember that tradition isn't stagnant in time, and material changes could influence how these furniture pieces were being made and used as well. But what we realized is in Churu in Rajasthan, we saw this structure built outside a new home, which of course from a distance looks like a chicken coop made out of metal. But a closer look really makes one realize that it was a space for storing water pots. But what's beautiful about it is that the water pots had been, there were holes created at the bottom of the water pots. A pipe had been attached and one could actually get the water out from a little tap at the front. And this was put up outside the house of a family who had again sort of installed this as an act of service towards society. So anyone was free to use it, but it was looked after by the family who actually had installed it. So this example really brought home to us that there was various things that one needed to think about. Furniture was rooted in cultural and everyday practices. It was also rooted in ideas of climate and weather. And also, as long as the need or the activity or the cultural need remained, there was going to be material innovation around these furniture pieces that we were encountering. And also to remember that furniture not necessarily meant movable ones, but it could also be inbuilt within the space. When we were visiting people's homes, of course, we were also sometimes asked to stay for a meal. We were sometimes hosted in their homes for the night or sometimes even for the duration of the field visit. So this meant that we had a greater access to the spaces that spaces within the home, and often were able to observe more closely as to how people use these spaces as well. And one such story was when we were in Barmer in this village called Mahabar. We visited the house of Tari Devi. And she had I'm just going to go back a second. And the architecture in Barmer and in this particular village was, the vernacular architecture was a cluster of spaces within a larger yard, and it was called a dhani. And Tari Devi had her own little kitchen space within that cluster. And she'd made this piece of furniture, which is called a kotlio, and is a type of larder used to store food prepared on the day and sometimes dairy products, and is made using an admixture of mud, dung, and hay, which also provides the thermal condition for storing these food items. While talking to her, she said to us that she'd made the kotlio when she had been married. So it was common practice for the bride to get married, and the mother-in-law would supervise, and the woman had to carve out spaces for herself within the house where it was needed, of course. It wasn't a mandate. But she had built this kotlio for herself when she had been married. And she remarked saying it was quite easily noticeable if someone had helped with it, or a younger apprentice had helped with it, because you could see sort of poor finishes on patches, as she called it. But what I want to highlight here is that on one hand, there's all these craft studies which point us towards formal structures of craft practices, and craft also being as a male-dominated practice. But within the context of the home, women were making furniture pieces and crafting their own spaces as well, and a lot of which has gone unnoticed up until now. Of course, not just with the furniture project, but of course, a lot of people are beginning to sort of address these lacks now. And on the other hand, we also recorded a similar kotlio in Jaisalmer. The kotlio was quite local to this part of Rajasthan and specific to Barmer and Jaisalmer districts. And this was Prem Bai's house, and she'd made this kotlio herself too. And of course, much like inquisitive researchers on field, our first question was, why do you have pink on it? And sometimes the answer is quite simple. She said her son had gone into town, bought a pack of distemper paint. There was a little left over from the purpose it had been used for. She liked the color, so she just painted it up. And she sort of highlighted the fact that these sort of mud furniture requires frequent maintenance. So annually, there's a layer of mud plaster that's added on to the furniture. But of course, she had chosen to now use paint, and she said she might continue to do that. it brings to light that there is not just the making of the furniture objects, but there is a continued association with maintaining it and looking after it, and also sort of attributing new identities to it with the physicality of the furniture design itself. And then within her kitchen space, she had this wall shelf built into the space, and this was called a beel, and it's made using twigs and mud plaster that is sort of built into the wall during the construction of the house itself, and used for storing vessels, and sometimes also a little niche dedicated to a shrine as well. So that's just a little glimpse of her kitchen space where multiple furniture types started coming together. And then, of course, that brings us to this idea of furniture not being isolated objects, but vernacular furniture was also forming a home. This was a residence in Dungarpur in Rajasthan. What you see here is a series of inbuilt cabinets in the kitchen space of the house. But each of these cabinets has got a different name, where the ones on the flat surfaces of the walls are called ada. The one you can see in the corner is actually called a tankunya. And if you notice closely, you'll see that the tankunya has a lock on it. And we were told that that was used to store valuables. Often women in the villages that we visited, that they had a little box in which they sort of packed up all their valuables and locked it away in a space that they frequently used, and which sometimes was the kitchen space. And we were told that the reason it's built that way is that if someone were to break in from the outside, it's harder to get in through a corner as opposed to a flat wall. So little details like these started becoming more evident. In the same house, you can see a paniara, you can see another inbuilt cabinet, which is an ada. And the family practiced agriculture, so there was also grain storage in the house, several granaries called koto and kotlis, and also charpais, which were used by the family. And of course, moving to how these objects also sort of hold embodied memories within them and can also become triggers for memories. In Punjab and Haryana, we recorded this piece of furniture called sandook. And sandook was a type of cabinet specifically commissioned to carry the bridal trousseau for the bride. And this would not just be an object in itself, but would be a container for several other various objects and furniture as well. So it would often contain low seats called pidha, which the woman would use, which were handcrafted. And it would also include hand fans, which are called pakki, and induni, which were the pot rings, and winnowers called chavla. And also the spinning wheel, the charka, was another common object within the trousseau as we recorded in the region. And this house in Punjab, as you can see, once we went in and we started talking about furniture, the family opened up their sandook and brought out objects that belonged to the gentleman's gentleman's mother. So she had received all these objects as part of her bridal trousseau when she'd been married, but they had put all of that away into the sandook and stored it after her death. And on the occasion when we visited them, they brought it out, and you can see the children's excitement. They literally got into the piece of furniture to get all these objects out. And conversations would often revolve around memories that people hold of their mothers and fathers who used these pieces of furniture. So there was a strong sense of personal memory associated with these objects. But in Punjab and Haryana, this idea of memory was not just personal, but extended to a larger collective one because of the events of 1947 and the crisis revolving around the partition and the migration of people. As you can imagine, the sandook would have required at least 4 or 5 people to lift it up. So one thing that became evident to us was all the sanduk that we were recording during field work was made after 1947. So this was one of the cues for us to be able to even date some of these pieces, which in other cases was quite difficult. So there were very few examples that we recorded which predated 1947, which probably was an indicator that it was left behind when people moved. Amongst the few that we recorded, which was sort of pre-1947, this was one such cabinet in Taran. And not only had it moved during 1947, but it had also moved sort of during the late 60s and early 70s, with conflicts around the border quite frequent at that time as well. And on one such occasion, if you look at the front leg of the sanduk, it's quite different to the rest of the legs. The leg had broken off on one such occasion of transporting it. And the family had consciously chosen to retain a different leg to remind them of those moves and those events that had impacted their life. On one hand, there was the story of people holding onto furniture and moving with it. But on the other hand, with this family here, this manja, which was the charpoy, was not theirs. It actually belonged to the family's neighbor. So the gentleman you see in the image, his father had inherited this manja from his neighbor who had to leave Punjab and who had to sort of move to Pakistan. And he'd made a promise saying if he ever came back, he would take the manja back. But if he didn't, could the family keep it as a reminder of the friendship that the family shared? So the son now still continues to have this manja. The legs are as is, but the webbing, which is the seat surface, has been, of course, repaired over time to maintain it. What would have once been gut or jute ropes is now cotton ropes that's used in the webbing. And like I said, we also discovered that furniture was not only movable, but also inbuilt. And this family of Sardar Budha Singh and Swinder Kaur in Taran again were talking to us about the objects that they held close to them and about the furniture that they held close. And they brought out the set of doors for us to see. And they said that the doors actually belonged to an inbuilt larder in their former home in Pakistan, in this village called Kamaya Pind. And when they had to leave and move to present-day Punjab in India, they had actually sort of removed these doors and carried it with them. What was interesting for us was not just the story of the family holding on to these doors, but also the craftsmanship on these doors. This type of lacquering was something that we hadn't recorded until then in any furniture pieces in Punjab, in the Indian side of Punjab. Which brings me to the next part of the project as well. We had a pidha from Chinyot in Pakistan, which in the collection, the image on the left is from the collection. And when we were traveling in Haryana, we met Gurdeep Singh, who was the only craftsperson we met who was still practicing that kind of lacquer work. And he brought to light to us that this type of lacquer work was actually practiced in Chinyot, and made us realize that partition not only caused people to migrate, but also caused a displacement of craft traditions and making practices as well. And his family had moved from Punjab to Haryana. And he said a lot of Muslim artisans were the ones practicing this type of lacquer work. So of course, there was a story of absence as well. For our team, it was not possible at that time to visit Pakistan. So the story of Punjab is really incomplete for us, because there's all these stories of absences and silences from the Pakistan side, which are yet to be told. which is where we've had the privilege of the collection as well, where we've been able to sort of reflect on it a bit further. And the fact that people like Gurdeep Singh sort of highlighted crafting practices. We met several others like him who make furniture. But on the other hand, we also realized that where furniture pieces were no longer being made, the crafting traditions were, again, not possible to record, which is where this approach of design played useful, and the approach of analyzing the crafts proved useful in the process. In the process of analyzing these crafts, a whole set of visual documentation was conducted. The second step was we took detailed measurements of each of these furniture types that we were recording on field. This is just an example from our field notes where measurements were taken of a Maju and of a Hitchco in Gujarat. And then these measurements were then transferred onto a 3D modeling software to create a model of the furniture, which was then further extrapolated onto 2D drawings. And these drawings were prepared with the precision of actually extruding out every single joinery and every single sort of fixing mechanism that went into the making of furniture. So this approach of producing drawings and analyzing the crafts really has given us the opportunity to understand how these pieces are made, but also has provided a repository for the future, for conservation, and for further making practices to continue. So this was the second component of that methodology in the project. And using this process, we were able to prepare about 124 technical drawings of all the furniture types across Northwest India. The last component of the methodological process involved using the collection, because this is not a sequential stage by process, but all these processes were overlapping. So we had all these objects in the collection, of which this is one of my favorite ones. In the object records that we held, this chest or this object was called a Banswara chest. And that's it. We had no other information about the chest, where it was from, what was going on, nothing. And up until the point of fieldwork in Rajasthan, which was sort of after about 4 or 5 visits, we were yet to encounter a furniture piece like this. And we were beginning to, of course, wonder whether it was even from Rajasthan. But we decided to nevertheless follow the lead of the object record, which said Banswara chest. Banswara is a place in southern Rajasthan, a small village and a district. So we decided to look for contacts in Banswara. And it turned out that we had a student at CEPT called Dharmesh, and his family came from southern Rajasthan. He put us in touch with his uncles, who then luckily were also a family of traditional sutars, who were carpenters. So they had a lineage of traditional carpentry in the family. So we were hosted by his uncle Jagdish Suthar, who you see in the image on the left. We landed in Dungarpur. He walked us through the villages and invited us to his home, and sat on this jhula, which was the only jhula of this kind which we recorded in Rajasthan. He started talking about his grandfather, who was the carpenter and had passed on all this traditional knowledge to them. He said that he was one amongst the few people in the village to have traveled to Gujarat for work, and he'd been able to make different types of furniture in Gujarat and had brought that knowledge back to Rajasthan. And this is an example of that sort of learning exchange that happened, where he had been able to sort of learn from a furniture piece in Gujarat that was used, which is the Hitchco, and had brought that knowledge back. He showed us all his tools. He was a practicing carpenter himself, and then eventually took us to the basement of his house, where we recorded our first Banswara chest, which actually is called a Maju. and is a specific type of cabinet, very local to only this part of Rajasthan, which is probably why someone had labeled it a Banswara chest. And then, of course, took us to various neighbors' homes where people showed us these maju in context. But what's interesting about this maju is that it's meant as a safe box as well. Therefore, the person commissioning it and the suthar making it would sort of agree on how it would be made. And no maju is sort of similar to one another, like it's all unique. And it's opened up with a sequential opening mechanism, all designed around joinery techniques and mechanisms. And the opening mechanism would only be known to the owner of the maju and the carpenter who had made it. So no two pieces were identical on this study. And the fact that all these maju were still in use during our fieldwork meant that we weren't able to look at the inside of a maju and therefore couldn't understand how it was made or constructed. Now, this is where we come back to the collection. On one hand, this particular maju had been opened up. We realized that it didn't have the same sort of construction mechanism that perhaps had been originally used. But then we found one maju in the collection which had never been opened up. And we were able to spend hours with this maju and realized that all the secret compartments in it were intact. And along with two of my colleagues, we opened up this maju and discovered 16 secret compartments, all made using a complex mechanism of joinery that existed. So that's just sort of about 3 or 4 stories. There's stories like this associated with all those 167 types of furniture that we recorded, layered with meanings, layered with sort of various associations. And the fact that we had this sort of unique methodological approach also meant we were able to diversify our research outputs. All the mapping and locating the furniture information through the form went into these 4 catalogs. Because we'd been able to record close to about 2,000 pieces of furniture in each of the states, we narrowed it down to about 400 pieces in each state, which would perhaps best represent vernacular furniture from the region. And those went into these 4 catalogs. So it's sort of an object-specific record of all the pieces that we've mapped. And then all the drawings were produced into drawing portfolios. And each of those 127 drawings have been sort of designed onto drawing plates. And there's plans, elevation sections, and extruded drawings of these furniture types. And then, of course, all that oral history and the voices from the people who actually make and use them have gone into these 3 books on each of the states. And the format of the book is that there are a few introductory chapters which sort of introduce how the project was approached, but the chunk of the books are chapters on each of these furniture types and thick with description from the oral history recordings and often includes the voices of the people who we interviewed. And then, of course, it concludes with some thematic chapters which started coming to life through the project. But we were very mindful that the project was the first of its kind. A documentation like this had never been carried out before. So despite several complex thematic themes coming out and theoretical premises that could be drawn out from it, we kept the focus to preparing a documentative repository so that it becomes a basis for further research on the project. So the books also have a huge number of visuals from fieldwork. And the intention was always to have this knowledge available for people to actually use and see. So we've created an open source website where all the information except the books in the form of the books are available to access as well. So there's a number of sections on the website which talk about the project. And before I sort of wrap up for the evening, I want to leave us with a few concluding reflections on what this project has taught us. One is, of course, it's provided us with a definition for what vernacular furniture could be. This by no means is definite. It is going to grow and change and evolve as people continue to learn and study vernacular furniture. But for now, we think that furniture made by craftspeople using locally available materials, serving a specific use or a specific ceremonial purpose, and sort of attributing a certain kind of identity to the people and the place is what could perhaps be vernacular furniture. The fact that it's timely documentation, lifestyles are changing far more rapidly than they did in the past, and a lot of furniture types are going out of use and being thrown out of context. So it's been quite timely to record these pieces still being used. I think I've mentioned a couple of times during the talk that this is the first ever study on the project. The one question that continued to haunt us throughout was, why was this so, given that there were so many associations? And for this, we've got to go back a bit in history. And we realized that it was, one of the reasons was probably because people who were looking at life in India and looking at objects and material culture just didn't recognize what furniture meant in that context, purely because of different understandings of furniture. I hope Todd will forgive me for raising this point because I'm speaking in this room, but including him said that, that there was no furniture in India and people ate and slept on the floors, and furniture in India, the beauty of furniture in India was the absence of it. And Todd specifically writes about people using a soft carpet hidden by a white cloth on which guests seat themselves. He was probably talking about the Baithak in Rajasthan. Again, the nuances are that if the seating arrangement is meant for one person, it's called a gadi masnad, where the gadi is the floor seat and the masnad are the bolsters that surround it. And in parts of Rajasthan and Punjab and Haryana, these become complete rooms and the arrangement sort of takes up the whole room, and the arrangement then becomes the Baithak, which is where guests are entertained. So it sort of begins to correlate and make sense. But my most favorite one is by Edwin Weeks, who illustrated a piece of furniture in Bikaner and also wrote in his accounts. He said the people have a way of keeping what at first sight appears to be their dining tables on streets in front of their houses, which brings me to the title of today's talk as well. And when we were traveling in Bikaner, we saw these supposed dining tables on streets. They were dotting the walled city of Bikaner on streets, on narrow lanes, in public squares. And these pieces of furniture were called pata, and they're public benches, again, very hyper-local to just the walled city of Bikaner. And has got a very gendered use, only men use it, to the extent that in certain patriarchal circumstances, women are asked to cover their faces while walking in front of a pata, even to this day. And the pata also has ceremonial uses during festivals. And if street plays are performed, men dress up as women to perform female characters because a woman can't use the pata. And talking to people, we asked them what the origin was or what the story was. And one of the hypotheses that was given to us is Bikaner, amongst all other parts of Rajasthan, was quite laden with merchant families. And the men often traveled on work, leaving the women and the younger children or the older male members at home. So the older male members would congregate on these public benches. And when it was located in squares, it was a way of also keeping an eye on the houses to ensure the families were safe in the absence of the men. The pata is quite a fascinating piece of furniture because there's issues of ownership that come up as well. So the pata is publicly owned, primarily publicly owned. This particular pata was owned by the panchayat. So if you notice, there's a little demarcation of land on there, and that land has been allotted to the panchayat as a specific site to locate the pata, and is often used for sort of local panchayat hearings when the village or the town people congregate. And sometimes it could be personally or privately owned as well, but for public use. A family in a little Guwad, which is a street called Sunaraka Gawad, a woman had commissioned a pata outside her house in memory of her late husband and had a little plaque put onto it as well. And then, of course, this was an opportunity for us to provide context to Edwin Week's illustration and to provide name and a story to what he called dining tables on streets. So there's that. He also pointed out that people play a game of chess, and people still continue to play games on the pata. So it's a tradition that continues. And some of these pata, because they're publicly owned, date back to more than about 100 years or so. On the other hand, we also recorded a number of similar benches in Shekhawati region, which were not called pata, but were called takhat. And these were not laden with the same kind of social constructs as the pata, but more used for personal use outside people's havelis and outside shops. They were slightly more ornately carved as compared to pata and Bikaner. This was primarily also emerging from the type of wood available in the different regions. The softwood in these parts allowed for more carving, whereas in Bikaner, they were not as detailed. The reason I'm also showing these takhat is because we've got examples in the collection. Initially, when I had the first opportunity to look at the benches in the collection, I thought, oh, yeah, these are pata from Bikaner. But a closer examination, of course, brought out that the similarities were more likely with the takhat from Shekhawati. But the primary reason for us to actually associate these ones in the collection to the Shekhawati region is because of this idea of ownership. The fact that they were publicly owned meant that the opportunity for them to enter into a trade market was much lesser than when it was privately owned. So we've been able to contextualize the pata and the benches in the collection as being takhat, perhaps from the Shekhawati region, which entered into the collection. And of course, this project is also opening up avenues for us to contextualize pieces in the collection. And we've got smaller larders, which were perhaps used for traveling purposes, similar to the ones that Tari Devi had made. We've got lacquered legged pidha, which are low stools and low chairs. And then, of course, this is another cabinet from the southern part of Rajasthan. So this project is not just helping provide context for furniture to furniture, but also to other objects in the collection. Often ornamentation on furniture drew from architectural features and elements as well. We've got these two door shutters from Rajasthan, again, with very similar carvings as on these cabinets. So again, they started providing context for these objects as well. And the way we were able to also make connections from fieldwork to objects is, this is a frieze panel on the Juna Mahal in Dungarpur with similar carvings as on the furniture and on the window shutters. So there's all these connections that we've been able to make to actually contextualize the pieces that we have. But the most important one for us is this idea of value creation within communities and bridging gaps between objects and people. In 2019, when we were just completing fieldwork in Punjab and Haryana, we got a call at the center from a young man in Punjab who telephoned us saying, I've just seen all these newsletters you're putting out on the project, and I hadn't even realized we've got a sandook in our family home, which has been locked up. Is there any way you can provide us contacts of craftspeople who could repair this piece of furniture? Which we were able to put him in touch with one or two craftspeople we'd met. He actually took the initiative to go get the sandook repaired, moved it to their new home, and sent us pictures of having done that. Even if this was a single incident, it brought brought home to us that the project was important, not just for the creation of this new knowledge, but also to instill value within communities and to create a sense of belonging for people. And I think for us, that's been the biggest achievement of the project. And we think that's also the biggest responsibility of this project, to give back to the community. And I leave you with that. Thank you so much.
Thank you for such a really delightful talk. I was really struck by the richness, sort of the ethnographic richness, which you brought to your exploration of these examples of furniture from your collection, and it makes the furniture tradition alive, and which actually was so brilliantly brought out in your last vignette, where you were able to, by taking an interest in this, in these art forms, to stimulate interest amongst peoples who had perhaps left them in a dusty cellar. So that was lovely. The question I had is, where do you think you will? Where do you take this now? I mean, I see actually your concluding vignette actually may be the answer is that as you move from documentation to outreach and to education through your website and through these books, but I suspect primarily through your website in India. I was wondering how you saw the project unfolding as it moves forward.
Well,
if you can come here and just.
I think one of the reasons I put this talk the way I did is to show that projects like this really grow with what we're learning during fieldwork and with time. So there was, when we started out, we didn't really know what we were looking for, but at the end of 8 years, we ended up with all this rich material. And I think, like I highlighted, of course, there's one component, which is contextualizing various collections where furniture could be. So this becomes a resource for that. Mm-hmm. Two, we've also created a concise methodology, which is outlined in the books and is on our website. And we've always said that if anyone wants to embark on documenting furniture in other parts of India or elsewhere, the methodology is open source. So hopefully this will lead to creation of more stories across. And I think from where I see it, this is really documentation knowledge. There's issues of gender that come up. There's issues of social construct that come up. There's crafting practices. There's social hierarchies and historical issues, which again, I only briefly touched upon. And then there's also the complex issues of trade of furniture and the ethics of that sort of trade, and how families are responding to that sense of belonging that is being lost or being held on. So I think there's a whole wide variety of avenues for further research. And our hope really is that this informs that further research. One of the things that we were able to do as part of the project was we were able to fund students at CEPT University to undertake their undergraduate dissertations, and they all undertook detailed studies on one furniture type. So that led into sort of academic work being produced on the subject, which meant on one hand, with the project, the scope was a certain amount, but with undertaking a dissertation, it sort of expands the scope to. So I think that's where I see it, as this just being foundational and just scratching the surface of the knowledge that there is out there. So our hope is really that someone will, or as many people will take it forward and not just us.
Fascinating. I think fascinating. I think by your definition, the vernacular creeps and changes gradually as it goes to the landscape. A change. Todd says it doesn't really change at all. But what happens when you come across the centre of otherness? I notice Chandigarh appears on the edge of your chart.
Yes.
Do you find that there's now, since the vernacular is bleeding into what the rooted in modernism, or indeed vice versa?
I think there is, what we realize is that there's space for both these stories to exist in India. I think the project also highlights that it doesn't have to be one versus the other, but we can hold space for diverse and plural narratives in a country like India. So yes, there is an audience who appreciates a Corbusier sort of definition of design and drawing from the crafting traditions of India, but creating a more aspirational modern for India at the time that it was created. But on the other hand, there's also all these people still holding on to these pieces of furniture for whom it's part of their everyday life. So I think in India, there's space for all of it to coexist. Yeah. Well, like I pointed out early in the talk, in our collection, most of the furniture pieces have been through second-hand furniture dealers. So because our the collection was primarily put together by our founders, and it stems from their own personal collection. And the way they acquired these things was they traveled every year in South Asia and Southeast Asia, primarily working with craftspeople to source contemporary examples of craft for their retail business. And on these travels, every time they saw something that they thought was a fine example of craftsmanship, they bought it and decided not to sell it. But at the time, of course, they were collecting it, and eventually it became this massive collection of about 6,000 objects at the time the trust was set up. And now it's 10,000 objects. Yeah. So often when you end up in craft clusters within India, you also end up with sort of access to handicraft markets and export markets where some of these objects do creep into. So yeah. But what's amazing, I do have to point out, is the reason we've been able to do so much work on the collection and using the collection is because Philip and Jeannie had the forethought to record every bit of information around the object's acquisition and provenance at the time that they were acquiring them. So we've got these massive paper records, which of course inform our database as well. And I would like to point out that my colleague Hannah is here tonight as well with us, and she's our collection manager. And between us, we've got this wealth of information from the source of collecting to work with. So that's one blessing we've got with the collection. We've got no issues of provenance in that sense. Yeah. And I have to admit, when we were also carrying out fieldwork, we were able to meet with some of these dealers and understand how these pieces end up in those dealerships as well. And there is a whole chapter in the Rajasthan book which covers how furniture moves into these sort of contexts and what happens at the grassroots. Of course, it's got all sorts of stories, with people wanting to let go of furniture, but sometimes not wanting to let go, and it all quite complex web of, yeah.
Presumably now, objects are finding you because the collection has become so well known.
Yeah.
That, so is the collection continuing to
Yes,
expand?
Yes, it is continuing to expand, and the objective has been to focus on examples of craft from South and Southeast Asia. Yeah.
There's extruded images showing how to make the item up until the way to do it. You have a graphic design and view that design. How did you achieve this?
Often it was a combination of tools and methods. During fieldwork where we had the privilege of spending more time with the furniture, we would sort of look quite closely at what sort of joinery details had been used. And for design practitioners and for people who have trained in furniture design, sometimes they are able to make out whether it's a certain kind of joinery or whether it's a dowel going in and opening out the door. So there was that aspect of observation. And then the second aspect of information also came from craftspeople. So during the project, we were able to meet with practitioners of craft, and there were quite a few furniture makers. One aspect that I couldn't cover in this talk, but is covered in the books, is this idea of changing lifestyles, but also change in materials and techniques. So people continue to make some of these furniture pieces, and we were able to interview them to understand what the ways in which these furniture pieces to be made. For example, with the pata, we met a craftsperson whose family had made pata for several generations. And he was able to give us information about the sort of corner brackets that support the two legs and the frame. He was able to give us names of the little metal components that go on there. And he was able to tell us the logic and reasoning behind why certain number of legs are used and how they're turned, what sort of tools would have been used. So often it was a whole combination of information that went into it. And then, of course, visual documentation aided as well. So we used to take several photographs, detailed photographs of the furniture, corners and joints and inside and outside and elevational shots, etc. So, yeah.
Anybody else ask? Was there anything in the 16th
Unfortunately not. Unfortunately not. But they were all there, quietly hidden away. Yeah.
Well,
We're hoping we got them all. We might have to have another go at it again.
Well, thank you very much for a lovely talk.
No, thank you so
Really
much.
interesting.